Hello, everyone. A good morning, afternoon, or evening, wherever you're joining us from. We're so glad to have you a part of this webinar and joining in. My name is Natasha Westheimer. I'm the co-coordinator of the Secretariat for the Climate and Environment Charter for Humanitarian Organizations. And I'm joined with my colleagues, Nishani Jaimaha, my co-coordinator, and Nico, who is supporting as well with the Secretariat at the moment through an internship program. And we are really grateful to be co-convening this webinar with the ECCP, the Community of Practice on Environment, Climate, Conflict, and Peace. Before we get started, I would like to share some technical and housekeeping details so you're ready to follow the event. This webinar will mostly be in English with also one speaker in Spanish. So we are experimenting. We have some translation, but also we'll be using live translated captions, and you can translate that into your language. To see these, you can select Show Captions or CC on the Zoom menu bar. What you can see I've circled here in red. It might be under the More section. And we'll be, hopefully, this will help us all understand and access this event as best as we can. We're recording it. This event will be uploaded to the Charter event page, and we'll have time for a Q&A as well. So please do share your questions in the chat box. If you have any specific questions for a speaker, please do indicate which one. And we also invite you to use the chat to introduce yourselves to those on the call. Today's session is about deepening our shared understanding of what it really means to advance climate and environmental action in fragile or conflict-affected settings. These are incredibly diverse contexts, but they all often have some shared challenge, which is that working on supporting communities in building climate resilience requires some navigation of the social or political tensions that exist. Which really is the case everywhere, but there's some really unique contexts in which the climate crisis may be accelerating conflict risk. That happens in some areas, but more common than that is that existing conflicts or fragilities and social or political tensions might exacerbate climate impacts, where the most vulnerable populations are those that are the most affected by climate change. And these are often contexts where humanitarian actors may be among the few with access, with presence, with trusted relationships with communities, but are having to navigate the complexity of working with such limited resources with so many competing priorities. I want to give a short story from my work prior to joining the Secretariat. I was working for many years in Palestine, largely on water access, water security, supporting communities across the West Bank in accessing sufficient water supplies. And in one of my visits to a village called Al-Raqiz in the south of the West Bank, I was speaking to Isa, who you see on the screen. He's the village patriarch. Isa's family had depended on accessing their land and water reservoirs to sustain themselves. They were a herding community, taking their sheep and goats out to graze in the rolling hills around the village. However, new Israeli settlement outposts were cropping up all around the village, and they were facing increasing violent attacks from these settlers and restrictions on their movement around the hills from the Israeli military. And the area that they could graze on was becoming smaller and smaller. The land itself was degrading, but it was really difficult to differentiate what was a product of climate change, of desertification, versus overgrazing sheep on their shrinking access to land. The reality was that Isa now needed to buy food for their sheep, and it was becoming a more difficult way of life. And when I spoke to him about climate change, he could explain to me, yes, we can feel how the changing climate is impacting our crops, our water reservoirs. But for us, even if we have the water reservoirs, the occupation prevents us from accessing it. The settlers are destroying our crops. and we cannot take the herds out to sustainably graze across the land. And so he reminded me that they could find their ways to adapt, but the occupation is what gets in the way. So that ending the occupation was the starting point for really building climate resilience. But nonetheless, humanitarian organizations and human rights organizations are working to support communities like Rakiz, helping them to access water supplies or find ways to create alternative food for their herds. But these organizations themselves also have to navigate risks in doing this work. Like in Rakiz, in so many communities that we work in as humanitarians, climate risks rarely stand alone. For some areas, conflict or fragility disrupts the systems people rely on to cope with climate shocks, like water network, like grazing routes, like basic infrastructure. And in some places, insecurity limits movement to different rangelands, leaving communities more exposed to climate risks. Or, like in Afghanistan, governance gaps and instability makes it harder for communities to manage natural resources. Displacement can also push people into areas with scarcer resources, increasing pressure on land and water. In urban settings, like in Ukraine, like in Gaza, we see environmental degradation of war from damaged infrastructure, from toxins and rubble, from degraded land. All of this erodes the ecosystems that people depend on for safety, for livelihoods and dignity, and shapes the complex climate risks that humanitarians must navigate alongside the security strains and the urgent needs of conflict. And this is all happening while humanitarians are also trying to think beyond immediate relief. Also, conflict-affected settings are places where well-timed interventions can also have a huge impact. Restoring water systems, rehabilitating land, or supporting with alternative livelihoods can also strengthen community resilience. In Rakiz, the village I mentioned, having humanitarian support with alternative livelihoods also strengthens their ability to stay on their land and avoid displacement. In some areas, humanitarian support can also contribute to peace building, reducing tensions around natural resources. And the humanitarian sector really has a role to play in spotting these opportunities, even amidst the complexity. Many signatories of the Charter work primarily or exclusively in these contexts. And for these organizations, we've heard your requests for more guidance and examples and peer exchange. And at the same time, we are learning and seeing the expertise you already have in navigating these dynamics and have growing insights on how to deliver on climate programming in these contexts. These insights are also really useful outside of the sector for those working in other spaces, like in the environmental peacebuilding or climate security world. So today's webinar, co-convened, as I mentioned, with the community of practice on environment, climate, conflict, and peace, aims to bring these worlds together, to introduce some of the frameworks and platforms working at this nexus of climate, conflict, and peace, to share some practical tools and resources, and also create a space for dialogue amongst those in this room. We hope it's just the beginning of a broader conversation. We're joined by a really diverse collection of speakers. We've organized the webinar into three parts. The first being on foundations. What do we mean by some of the terminology? What does this nexus look like? Secondly, we'll introduce a collection of resources designed to support with programming and operations. And lastly, we'll open up the discussion on what's working and what's needed to enable greater action in these contexts, with 2 case studies from signatories and some time for reflection. So we invite you to listen and question, share your experiences. With that, I think we'll begin. I'll hand the floor over to Kira Tarif, who is a researcher at the CIPRI Climate Change and Risk Program. Kira, it's really lovely to have you here. CIPRI is one of the most respected think tanks working on topics related to conflict and peace. And your work in particular touches on the intersections of climate change, violent conflict, and peace for our audience, which includes a diverse range of humanitarian organizations and those from outside the sector that may be a little less familiar with some of the conflict and peace world. We hope you can help understand this space a bit better. So I have two questions for you. The first is, how can evidence and frameworks from the climate security and environmental peacebuilding fields help humanitarians strengthen climate and environmental action in fragile and conflict-affected settings? And what practical tools, entry points, or approaches can humanitarians adopt to begin integrating climate security considerations into their work? And with that, over to you.
Thank you, Natasha. I'm going to try and share my screen here as well. I hope that that works and you can see my presentation.
Yes, it works.
And Great. And I just want to also say hello. There's some familiar names and faces in this call, so hello to everyone. It's my pleasure to be here and to be able to speak to these two questions as quickly as I can and as effectively in 10 minutes. But I look forward to having a discussion afterwards. I'll be very interested to hear your questions and comments. But maybe just to start with a little bit of framing on this topic, I think uh, climate shocks and conflict dynamics are two factors that are overlapping in different contexts. I think Natasha did a great job of introducing some of those dynamics and examples. We also see evidence from our research at CIPRI of how these dynamics are shaping each other as well. So our research has shown that climate impacts rarely, very rarely cause conflict on their own. But climate change isn't happening in a vacuum. It's interacting with political and social and economic conditions and vulnerabilities in ways that create intersecting pathways of risk. I think that understanding these pathways can offer humanitarians a way to analyze both early warning signs and indicators to better target interventions and maybe also to identify entry points for reducing people's vulnerabilities and for preventing harm as well in the context of a changing climate. Um, I won't spend too much time on these pathways because I have other points to get through in 10 minutes, but I also just wanted to mention that we have an analytical framework at CIPRI that focuses on how climate exposure interacts with pre-existing vulnerabilities to increase the risk of insecurity. Climate exposure here means things like rising temperature, changing rainfall patterns, more extreme weather events, the biophysical effects of climate change, where climate vulnerability speaks to the social, economic, and political conditions that can increase people's vulnerability to those physical effects. This can be things like very high reliance or dependence on rain-fed agriculture, or weak environmental governance, or marginalization, exclusion, poverty, gender inequalities that make some people more vulnerable than others as well. And our research has been conducted on this topic across different regions globally, and we've identified that there are four pathways. They're not deterministic pathways, but they're commonly observed routes through which climate impacts can heighten insecurity. The first is about livelihood deterioration. This is how climate shocks can undermine people's access to water, to forests, to grazing land, to fisheries. And when there's very little alternative income generation opportunities, there's a risk that that competition intensifies around access to those resources. I think without going into many examples, I'll be happy to come back to those later if needed. But I think that this is a way, this is an element that humanitarians can use in an analysis to identify when climate impacts are aggravating livelihood conflicts, how to target assistance in ways that is going to reduce competition and not unintentionally reinforce competition, but maybe create some opportunities for collaboration as well, which is the next step. The second point is about migration, displacement, and mobility. So environmental change alters migration routes. Disasters also can lead to displacement, sometimes into areas that are already under their own forms of socioeconomic and political stress. While I want to emphasize that mobility is not inherently a destabilizing force, and actually it's a very important means of adaptation, where local institutions are weak, unmanaged migration can also accelerate tensions around access to jobs and access to services and land tenure and also political forms of representation as well. The third pathway is about armed groups and how armed groups can exploit the effects of climate change on the environment in multiple ways. This can be sort of opportunistically sort of controlling territories or resources. It can be about leveraging environmental grievances. Um, but I think that it's an important point for humanitarian actors who are operating in those areas to consider how climate change can shape and reshape conflict economies and how it can create new incentives for armed actors and new forms of legitimacy as well on the ground. And then the fourth and final pathway, I'm almost done with this part, is about how climate impacts and the responses to disasters can actually create opportunities for elites to consolidate their power at the expense of weaker groups. This can be about controlling resources that are becoming more scarce and more valuable or more valuable. It can be about capturing or diverting aid. It can be about manipulating migration for political gain. And for humanitarians, I think this really underscores the need for conflict-sensitive programming in the area of climate action because it's a very political process. It really requires transparency and democratic action and accountability mechanisms on the ground. So it's not just a sort of neutral process. And so what this means for humanitarian action, I just want to highlight maybe two core messages coming out of this pathways framework. I think the first thing is that climate risks are really deeply social, political, and context specific phenomena. And so this points to the fact that technical fixes are not sufficient, and humanitarian actors can use their conflict analysis and their very strong understanding of local governance systems to achieve conflict-sensitive approaches to dealing with climate change. I think this is also an opportunity. This is a space where climate action can perhaps also contribute to strengthening community resilience. It can reduce tensions around access to resources, and it can contribute in the longer term to some of the sort of key building blocks for peace. And that leads to the second question, which is about practical tools and entry points for humanitarians. So I wanted to highlight some examples of where climate projects have become confidence building measures. When they've been designed intentionally, this is a very core element of environmental peace building approaches. One example is an example from IOM in Somalia. It's about locally co-owned climate infrastructure, where we saw promising practices that included things like co-funding mechanisms that were pooling diaspora remittances and community contributions, financial contributions, and humanitarian seed funding to actually finance the implementation of climate action. The production of which included things like co-owned, between multiple communities, co-owned water infrastructure that actually enabled displaced people to return home in the context of a very severe drought. And it also was a process that really strengthened community involvement in processes like tendering and oversight and management of that project, which really strengthens like local governance and local ownership of climate action as well. So that was an approach that I think can reduce dependencies and increase sustainability of those efforts as well. The second example that I want to highlight is about small-scale clean energy. This was an attempt to reduce reliance on charcoal and deforestation in order to produce charcoal. That is one of the drivers of competition and conflict between farming and herding communities. And this was also in its own way designed to connect local communities to local authorities to local businesses who could actually implement and then maintain this the technical process of maintaining this infrastructure. But it was also something that was in its own way sort of democratizing access to energy in a country where energy is very expensive, very hard to access in rural communities. So it's a very small but a very strategic energy project that increases people's resilience, and it also reduces some of the environmental drivers of conflict at the same time. And then moving away from that, I also wanted to speak to some of the more low-tech and low-cost climate adaptation practices that I've also seen, including regenerative agriculture, water harvesting, earthworks. This is a sort of alternative to sort of emphasizing drought-resistant seeds, but rather supporting permaculture-based regenerative systems that are locally maintainable, that are adapted to dry lands, that are using shovels to create things like contour bunds and swales and half moon bases to capture rainwater, but also emphasizing agroforestry and native trees and so on for shade and fodder and soil health. Also, indigenous seed preservation systems, community seed banks and seed networks that are helping farmers to maintain and exchange local adapted varieties of seeds, which can sort of reduce their reliance on drought-resistant seeds and doesn't require them to have external inputs every season. It improves diversity, and at the same time, it's also a means of really putting at the center sort of women's knowledge about seeds. Women play a very strong role in seed custodianship and seed maintenance in different parts of the world. So this is a way of also centering women's knowledge and roles in environmental action in this very concrete way. And maybe just to end on the point about this low-tech approach to climate resilience, I think it's really an opportunity to bring together adaptation with very participatory and inclusive design and planning processes. They're very well adapted to that kind of work. And I think that's essential in conflict affected settings. So it's an opportunity to bring different parts of the community together to discuss and then to actually implement these changes because they're quite labor intensive. Yes, that they can also therefore produce forms of social cohesion because it requires cooperation and generates very quick and very visible benefits. So I maybe just want to end by saying that our research at CIPRI has shown that climate impacts are really never purely environmental phenomena. They're extremely related to social realities, political economies, and conflict dynamics. And I think for humanitarians, there's a real opportunity to advance climate action that is conflict sensitive and that's very locally grounded and that can be responsive to opportunities for peace as well because of that on the ground knowledge that Natasha was talking about before. But I'll stop here and thank you so much. And I'll be happy to talk about these points further.
Kira, thank you so much. I think that was a really helpful framing for this conversation today in helping understand some of these pathways and opportunities for these programming, yeah, and peace building dividends as well. It's a great framing for this conversation, and as well, how do we get started as humanitarians? That's part of the idea of this next section. Nishani will facilitate us in thinking about some of the resources and tools that humanitarians can use to help really understand this in a programmatic and operational way. And so with that, Nishani, over to you. If people have questions for Kira, please feel free to add them into the chat, and we'll go from there. Thanks, Nishani. Over to you.
Thanks, Natasha, and really thanks, Kira, for setting that frame and setting the scene for us. And as you mentioned also rightly, some of the tools and resources are really useful for humanitarians on the ground to put these into practice or peace building community to put it into practice. And so first, I would like to turn to Raquel Munaye. She is a member of the Community of Practice on Environment, Climate, Conflict and Peace, ECCP. And maybe Raquel, it'll be really good to hear from you. Can you introduce us to the Tools and Resources Guide? And you really put in a lot of effort into this. So thank you so much for all your time, energy, and amazing work done to work on this and how it's structured and how can humanitarian organizations practically use it so that we can advance climate action in fragile and conflict affected settings. Over to you.
Thank you so much. Hi, everyone. Thanks, Nishani. Thanks, Natasha and everyone. Yes, it was a great thing to be a part of supporting the creation of this resource, which is very practice oriented. As we've heard the reasons why this needs to be done, we now come to the question, how do we do it? I am here, project is in the middle or starting or ending, and this needs to be done. And that's the idea behind the creation of this guide, of this list of resources, which I will introduce to you now very quickly in a as practical as possible way to allow you to use it and navigate it more smoothly. So first of all, so you probably see my screen, I suppose. Very good. Yeah. first of all, just the basics. This is a resource that can be accessed in two ways. You have here the website, which is what I'm sharing with you, but you also have a PDF version right here below the tags that you can download. And they're identical to each other, the website and the PDF versions. But if you are in a place with more unstable internet, you might want to download the PDF version. In the website, it is a little bit more interactive because then you can jump between sections. And I would like to introduce this to you today. So there are 5 sections here. Let me maybe show this here. There are 5 sections, mostly based on a logic of a project stage, but also one here that is a little bit of an outlier. I will just quickly go through them and to help you understand how you can best use it for your needs. So let's say you are at the planning phase, perhaps you're applying for a grant or you're preparing to explain the concept to a different audience that doesn't know about this topic. Then you might benefit from the frameworks and principles section and the resources that you find here, because you can find there some talking points and narratives to support your needs. Then you have here the very self-explanatory section, conducting assessments. So if you are at the beginning of a project needing to conduct needs and risk assessments for your project, you have here a selection of tools and guides specifically for this. As you can see, also just to give you an example, we also have a tags, right? And you can see all the tags up here. The tags themselves are not interactive, but you can do a Control F and kind of like search them through. Works both on the website and the PDF if you're looking for something that is specific to these tags. Uh, but yeah, every resource will have it listed under what kind of resource it is, what kind of themes it addresses, and also the sector that it relates to, and the languages. By the way, just as a side note, all the resources are primarily in English, but we've added a language section because some of the resources also offer other language versions. And then we have the programming section. The programming section is by far the largest, the longest in the list, and I think that this is very much reflecting the need. Most of the needs of practitioners and policymakers is how to make this happen on the ground. There's a lot of need, and therefore there's also a lot of effort from organizations to put together resources for this. And the good news of having such a long list of resources is that, of course, you're going to have a bigger variety. So you're going to have more subtopics represented. You might even have some that have a regional or a country focus. So you have a lot of resources here to navigate through. Do feel free to use the tags if you're in a hurry, but if you're not, do take a look at everything because there might be something there for you that you couldn't think of. And then the last one that is related to project phase would be for monitoring, evaluation, and learning. So for those of you who are already at the end of the project or even post-project and needing to go back to synthesize learnings, there are resources here as well for you, case studies, briefs, reports, and things like that. Finally, the data sets is a little bit of an outlier, but we thought it was interesting to have it as its own section because it can come up. Your need for data might come up at any stage. It could come up from the beginning to the end. And data sets speak specifically to resources where you can really access and download data, quantitative data, models, maps. They're all different. But they're very specific to data. They're not text. So we wanted you to also have a quick access to this kind of resource. Otherwise, there are also several types of resource amongst the resources. There are also multimedia, interactive guides, actor-based, and of course, a lot of reports and briefs. So I just did a very quick overview because of time. I wanted to leave it open in case you have any questions. I think that they already shared the link to the both the website and the PDF versions in the chat. If you have any
We'll come back
questions,
to questions. Exactly.
yeah,
Yes.
exactly.
Thank
Also, you can also just ask me in the chat or anything. Thank you so much.
you. Thank you so much for sharing that, Raquel. It's really useful to navigate this because some of these tools and guidance can be quite tough to like, where do we start? How do we start? So this is super useful. And next we have two deep dives that we're going to go into from some of the resources we have already on this. So I'd like to first move on to Rebecca Farnham, the Knowledge Hub for Locally Led Climate Action. She's on peace and security, and she's with the Knowledge Hub for Locally Led Action on Climate, Peace and Security. So sorry. Who will deep dive into the framework on locally led action. And I'd like to ask you two questions, Rebecca. What is a framework for locally led action on climate, peace, and security, and who is it designed for? And how can practitioners practically use it or parts of it? And where should a humanitarian organization start? Because that's not always easy to where to start. And can you share a concrete example on how the framework has been applied in practice? Over to you, Becca.
Absolutely. Thanks so much. And thanks for having me. And thank you to all of you for your time and attention. The Knowledge Hub on Locally Led Action on Climate, Peace, and Security is coming from and sharing lessons learned from an ongoing partnership between the European Union and the United Nations Environment Programme. But it is mostly written by community voices and emerging professionals around the world who have been exploring the interactions between how climate, conflict, cooperation are playing out for communities around the world. If you would please, next slide for me, Natasha. Thank you. So in a nutshell, the idea of locally led action on climate, peace, and security, or CPS, as I might abbreviate it, is about understanding that participatory processes and community-owned responses to all of these issues are going to be the most sustainable, both environmentally and socially, because communities know their context better than anyone else. Many of you who've been working in the humanitarian development sectors for years do not need me to tell you this. But it's still news for some of our global policymakers, I would say. So part of this is championing and translating that kind of up the scalar ladder while also amplifying and equipping folks who are down the scalar ladder on the ground. So mobilizing participation to deal with all of these complex interactions, really highlighting the role of nature-based solutions and how climate change can be and has been a conflict driver, but the environment itself, including our concerns around it, can really help us solve these problems as well. So we want to lean into that. And the ultimate goal is around this peace positive climate resilience, so that communities are no longer having to choose between climate adaptation and peace, but see these as really inherently linked and things that can inform each other. So next slide, please. Thanks so much, Natasha. How this is used, the Knowledge Hub itself is a main website that has three main functions. Firstly, it is essentially a free and open training course that can be used for project staff and communities who are trying to figure out more how to talk about or how to think about the interactions between environmental change, conflict, and cooperation. The course explains the intersections, including kind of key theories and policy frameworks that are being used to talk about them in accessible language. It is written mostly in English, but it's also set up so that online translators, which are getting better and better, should really easily be able to swap over. And some of the content is also written directly in other languages to help. So in addition to that kind of training course about the concepts and theories, it also provides a guide and a toolkit for project leaders, tips and tricks about how to facilitate project management, directly responding and trying to tackle these issues. And then there's also a resource library as a place to find exciting news about projects that are dealing with these interactions, and hopefully also examples of best practices that have worked in other places to get some inspiration for what kind of projects communities might do in other contexts. If we can, next slide. The action toolkit itself is organized by units, and it follows the project management cycle. So we go from kind of scoping to mobilizing communities, analyzing the problem, identifying solutions, planning and implementing an action itself, and of course, monitoring and evaluation. For each of the units, you have a thematic menu, kind of like what you see on this particular slide. And the structure of the website is built for you to be able to pick and choose what you want to learn about. So you can read it straight through, but each section is also written to be standalone. So there are theories, tools, and case study examples included for each, and you can kind of click and hyperlink around. Right now it is a website. We are working on an interactive PDF as well as Word documents that will enable community partners to translate all of these tools more easily. So one thing to flag here is that this is a living project in progress, and hopefully more and more resources will come as we go. But for now, the website is set for you to be able to jump around. So if you feel like you know a lot about climate-related risks, you skip that and you move on to driver mapping, etc. We can do next slide, please. Each unit of project management also showcases key takeaways and action items, which can help you identify what pieces of the toolkit are the best entry point, which will be most relevant and helpful for you. On to the fun stuff. So next slide, please. The toolkit, I want to say, builds a lot on other resources and initiatives. We did not make this up ourselves, of course. And one kind of advantage of the website format is that we've actively showcased a lot of these other resources in the course itself. So the website can help you find more detailed examples and tools for any specific concepts that you want to dive more into, as well as doing really kind of snapshot overviews of what these things are. For each tool, if we can next slide, probably the most practical resource for most of you on the hub are worksheets that we've created for a wide variety of tools in project management. Some of these tools, like a log frame, are probably going to be very familiar to those of you working in the humanitarian space. But there are also worksheets that will help groups understand the environment, climate, conflict, and peace issues specific to their context. And there are also brand new tools that we've developed just for this. So please do take a look at those and kind of figure out how they can help you unravel climate, peace, and security for you. The worksheets have been designed so they can be used by someone kind of scoping out a project on their own, but also they can be used by diverse community members. And the website includes guidance for facilitators on how to have a group of people who have all done the worksheet individually, then come together with another activity so that you're engaging groups in participatory analysis on all of these things. And it is analyzed, designed, and implemented directly by the community itself. If we can switch to the next slide. Beyond the skill building toolkit, the hub also includes a resource library that has analyses, project reports, reviews of best practice, plenty more. Again, this is a living website. We're adding tools and resources all the time, and we'd love to hear about things that you think should be included in this resource library. So if you have other things, and several of what is being highlighted in this webinar will be added to it this weekend. And if we can go to our final slide, in response to your kind of last question there, Nishani, the last thing I'll highlight from the website is that used to help with the teaching course, but also highlight fun things from around the world. There are a variety of case studies that are based on real world scenarios, but have been made intentionally a bit more generic to help showcase some of the very diverse ways that climate and conflict are exacerbating each other around the world. But those case studies are also then highlighting some of the sustainable and nature-based solutions that communities can put into practice to respond. So from this framework of locally led action on climate, peace, and security, and supported a bit by the EU UNEP project financially, we have a handful of initiatives around the world doing direct action and response. A couple of them that I think are particularly fun. In Ecuador, the Tierra Viva organization is using a combination of creative but low-tech innovation and social agreements to build a community-run water harvesting system that helps reduce concerns about water scarcity and the conflict that they've been experiencing as a result. And in Mexico, the El Triunfo Conservation Fund has partnered with communities in their local river basin to create a community fire management brigade in response to the fire and drought-induced concerns that they've been experiencing more and more in the past. We have projects now being launched in Central Asia and South Asia, so we'll have many more, we hope, to highlight in the coming months. But for now, I will go ahead and end it there and to say thank you again. And I am very happy to have follow-up conversations. And if there are things that people see that aren't in the hub that you think should be, please do let me know. Thanks so much.
Thanks so much, Becca. That was super useful, and I really like the tips, tricks, and it's really practical and usable for project leaders, and there's case studies. So I think that's amazing. Due to Jane having to leave a little early, I'm going to jump over to Jane. And Jane, are you on the call? Jane is providing some inspiration and Ignite talks. She's the head of Water and Environment Research Department of the Applied Research Institute in Jerusalem. And Jane, I think in this context, as in a context that's politically constrained, such as the occupied West Bank, what innovative or adaptive approaches has Courage developed to support climate resilient livelihoods and food systems. And this is going to be part of a conversation we're going to have afterwards. But Jane, we would love to hear from you on this. Over to you, Jane.
Thank you very much, and thank you for inviting me to speak about the Palestinian constant as we are under the Israeli occupation. And today I will speak about the Palestinian resilience under the Israeli occupation, in particular Arej's innovations for sustainable livelihood and food system. Working under occupation and under the restriction of the occupied West Bank, which is characterized by limited mobility because of the Israeli checkpoints around the Palestinian localities in the West Bank, and the fragmented areas, again, as a result of the division for Area A and Area B and Area C, and finally the restricted access to nature resources as water. So Arej has adopted innovative, adaptive, and community-driven approaches in order to strengthen the climate resilience, livelihood, and food system. Such approaches are the environmental governance and climate justice advocacy, cluster-based resilience modules that overcome the fragmentation of the Palestinian area, localization of food system and value chain. And now I can speak more about these approaches. Arej, we can make the other slide. Arej is working toward strengthening community voices and advancing the climate and environmental justice through several key approaches. Some example of these approaches are building the capacity of marginalized groups, including women, youth, and smallholder farmers, in order to advocate for equitable access to land, water, and nature resources. Also, we are working in order to and using or applying a human rights-based and gender approach that links the rights of individuals and communities with obligations of duty barriers, ensuring that environmental governance reflect fairness, inclusion, and accountability. Also, we are trying to enhancing accountability mechanism by training the civil society organization to monitor the environmental violation, document injustice, and develop evidence-based advocacy tools even with the political situation that we are living as a Palestinian, as a Palestinian. Also, recognizing climate change as a socio-political challenge, ARIJ integrated climate justice to farming to address structural inequalities that limit Palestinian adaptive capacity. This includes the documentation of the environmental injustice that the Palestinians are experiencing. And these are the photos of the water pipes that the Israeli soldiers destroyed. And this is in Area C, where is the Palestinian, they don't have a water a network or water for even domestic use. Also, ARIJ introduced a cluster-based module, which is an innovative approach for the West Bank situation, where communities are isolated by movement restrictions and, of course, the division of the area A, B, and C. And this module link the neighboring communities into geographical clusters, enabling them to share the infrastructure such as the water system, storage facilities, grazing management. Also, we are trying to promote collective learning, market linkages, and joint planning to overcoming fragmentation and ensuring equitable benefit distribution. Also, we are trying to support the coordinated resources use across the agricultural land, strengthening climate resilience at a household level, community, and cluster level. These some of the example of the REACH interventions are specifically adapted to climate challenges faced by Palestinians, particularly the severe restrictions on access to nature resources. We introduce water efficient irrigation, rainwater harvesting in communities lacking centralized water access. And also these are in different level at a household, community, and cluster level. Also, we are trying to diversified livelihood and drought-resistant crops in order to especially in area C, because in area C we have this limitation in access to the land. Also introduce renewable energy powered agriculture, for example, the solar pumping in the agricultural wells and small scale solar systems to reduce reliance on costly, unreliable energy. Also, we have innovative small-scale green solution supported through community-based financing mechanism, supporting the value chain, local processing and cooperative entrepreneurs, enhancing storage, packaging, and distribution capacities so community can withstand market shocks. Connecting small farmers, women, and youth to local markets through improved infrastructure and institutional support. And finally, ARIJ integrated risk management and community resilience plans that address both climate challenges or hazards and occupation-related risk. These plans help communities to prepare for droughts, land access restriction, water shortage, and mobility restriction. Also, it strengthens local governance structure that can support it quickly to environmental and political shocks. And thank you. It's a small presentation that can give you an overview about the ARIJ tools and approaches that we are implemented in our situation in the West Bank. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Jane. I mean, it's really amazing to see the amount of work that's been done in really difficult contexts, such as the West Bank, and in a context where it's, conflict context, and this, very practical work that you're doing on the ground is really useful for other organizations who are also in similar situations or in other conflict and fragile settings to be inspired by this sort of, work you're doing. It's really amazing. I can see everyone, clapping and really being motivated. So thank you so much for sharing this. We know that you need to leave in a bit due to obvious circumstances. So thank you very much. We hope you can stay on if so, but understand completely. Thank you for sharing. And this is a perfect segue to head over to Julianne Schillinger. Julianne's the technical advisor on climate and conflict of the Red Cross Red Crescent Climate Center. And Julianne, you're going to help us to do a little bit of a deep dive into the handbook on navigating fragility, conflict, and violence to strengthen community resilience, and really, linking very much with what Jane has mentioned, and what, some of the work that Jane and RH is doing in the West Bank. What is the handbook, Julianne, and how can it serve as a practical entry point for humanitarians working on climate action in fragile and conflict-affected contexts? And from your experience, what are humanitarian actors seeing on the ground in these contexts? And how can approaches highlighted in the handbook help communities avoid harmful coping strategies or strengthen their ability to manage climate-related stresses? So over to you, Julian, to help us understand better.
Thank you, Nishani. And it's a bit of a challenge to now come back with a specific resource after we just heard these very practical experiences from Jane. Thank you so much for sharing those. Before I start talking really about the handbook, I want to take a little step back because the eagle-eyed of you will see that this is a handbook on disaster risk reduction. And I think it's interesting for us to remember sometimes that as we're talking about climate, or if we're talking about disaster risk reduction, I know some of the anticipatory action colleagues are also in this webinar. I've seen some of you in the chat. At the end of the day, quite often we are talking about very similar contents. And I think we have seen, especially across the Red Cross Red Crescent movement over the past couple of years, that where traditionally our role was very firmly in disaster risk management within different countries, especially from the perspective of the national societies, more and more of our Red Cross colleagues have really started to embrace this climate side of the disaster risk reduction work that we're doing. And so we've seen national societies getting more and more active on climate. At the same time, over the last few years, as fragile and conflict-affected situations have become more protracted, we've also seen that the historical division that we've had in the movement between sort of the ICRC doing primarily conflict-related humanitarian work and the national societies and the IFRC mostly doing sort of more natural hazards and disaster-related work, this division also starts to blur. And so we got to a point to say, well, how do we actually, as a movement, and specifically as the national societies, approach climate action, approach disaster risk reduction in those settings that are affected by fragility, by conflict, by violence? So this is basically where this handbook started, in a sense, with this recognition that across the movement, we're already doing a lot, but we're not necessarily doing it well together. And there is a lot of improvement in terms of coordination, but also just a lot to learn from each other. So for us, it was a really nice initiative that came together, spearheaded by the German Red Cross, with us at the Climate Center, but then also in very close collaboration with the IFRC, with the ICRC, as those two big pillars, basically, of the movement really coming together behind this initiative. And our starting point, as I said, was really just this acknowledgement that there is so much knowledge already. There is so much happening on protracted crisis, on disaster risk management, different approaches to institutional preparedness within the movement. So when we started this work, we really just sat down and put all of those different frameworks, all of those different initiatives on the table to see what comes out of it. And what you can see here is a bit of the overview and the chaos, the cluster of different words that we came up with, work that is specifically on community engagement, this big element of community resilience that we're all talking about, but then also how do we approach this in complex emergencies? So kind of acknowledging that there's already a lot going on, but it's not necessarily connected. We started pulling together this handbook a little bit as a learning pathway for ourselves, but also for the movement as a whole, and maybe as a roadmap to help us navigate all of the knowledge that we already have within the movement. So the goal was really to make it practical, make it very accessible for all of our different colleagues within the movement, but of course also beyond. I very much hope this is useful to other humanitarian organizations as well, and to support those colleagues really with sort of concise guidance, with examples, but also with just very operational, day-to-day programming relevant points. I already said this was really a bit of an overview of existing tools that would then help us to illustrate how disaster risk reduction, but also climate action broadly, can really happen in fragile, conflict-affected or violent settings. A lot of this, almost everything really, is really based on the practical work of our colleagues around the world of different national societies. And I'm incredibly happy that Edgardo is here from the Colombian Red Cross, and he will speak right after this, because that means I don't have to give the examples. We have Edgardo here to just tell us directly what the Colombian colleagues have been doing over the last years. Because I think for us, the real focus here is on the expertise of all of our national societies. The handbook itself has examples from all of these different countries you see on the screen here, but then we worked very closely with the Colombian colleagues, but also with our colleagues in Bangladesh, Lebanon, and South Sudan, to have a little bit more elaborate examples and case studies of how they really tackle specific challenges in their settings. In addition to these sort of practical learnings that we have from the movement, just want to give you a very, very quick overview of what the handbook contents themselves really are. We're not going to go beyond this slide on that, so I invite you to just kind of click through the PDF. I will put the link in the chat in just a minute if you want to know more about sort of what is in these specific chapters. But just as an overview, we basically have this big building block of the foundations, which in a sense is this kind of fragility, conflict, and violence 101, what the different terminologies mean, what are impacts on community resilience, how do we operate, what are our ways of working in those settings. So if you're completely new to working on humanitarian issues in a conflict setting, this is basically where you can start. If you already know, if you've been working or living in conflict settings for all of your life, you probably don't need the foundations. You know this better than me. And then we have the more kind of content-heavy parts that, as a movement handbook, are sort of structured around one of our key frameworks, the roadmap to community resilience, which is what a lot of the national society work with communities is based on. So we basically went back to seeing, okay, how does the Red Cross operate in a lot of settings, and how can we directly add to that by essentially mirroring the structure of having 4 stages that you can see here, where at the beginning, we're really talking about the sort of initial community engagement, initial institutional preparedness. How do we ensure that, as Kira said at the beginning, everything we're doing is really conflict sensitive, and it is very participatory, and we're putting the leadership with the communities themselves. Second stage, understanding risk and resilience, is a little bit more the analytical part of it. How do we conceptualize this overlap of climate and conflict risks, for example, and what does that mean in an enhanced vulnerability and capacity assessment, as we often do them within the movement? We're then going more towards the actual action stage. How do we work with communities to actually implement climate action or disaster risk reduction. And then the last stage, as we usually have them, as monitoring, evaluation, and big emphasis, learning, really reflecting that for all of us, this is still relatively new territory. So the number one responsibility that we see next to the accountability to those affected populations that we serve is also an accountability to ourselves to ensure that we continuously learn from successes, but also from failures. So how do we really make that work in those settings? There's a lot of practical resources, a lot of case studies I already mentioned. And for those people who really like reading, there's suggestions for even further reading. So a lot of materials really in this handbook. Very quick shout out at this point just to a sister resource that we have, which is a toolkit that basically takes the handbook contents and really puts them in a more focused way for anticipatory action. So for those of you, I saw that we have some colleagues from the Early Warning for All initiative, for example. For those, the anticipatory action toolkit would really be sort of the one step further to making this very practical. Nishani, to your second question, kind of where does this all come together? What do we see on the ground? I think for us, the central element here, and I'm very minimalistic on the slide, is really this focus on strengthening the community resilience. We work with communities. We start with communities, we end with communities in everything we do. And I think really empowering that level to take the lead in climate action is so central to everything we do, but particularly in conflict-affected settings. That also means really thinking about resilience in a holistic way. So to think about, of course, what are these kind of immediate environmental factors? We talked already about sort of economic resilience and livelihoods, but for example, also social cohesion, safety networks, traditional conflict resolution mechanisms, sort of all of these different components that really come together in resilience to ensure that people are less vulnerable, that they are less inclined to take harmful coping strategies whenever some shock hits, whether that's climate, whether it's conflict related, whether that's something else entirely. So I think for us, that is really the point to come in as the humanitarians, ensuring that the communities are resilient and working with them as best as we can to ensure that they are the leaders in determining what that resilience means and how to strengthen it. And with that, I think, Nishani, I can pass it back to you, and then hopefully we can hear from the Colombian colleagues on what that means in practice.
Absolutely. And I think, what you mentioned really reflects also what, Jane was sharing in her experience and the work that Courage is doing. And definitely we're going to hear from the Colombian colleagues. So due to time, Anika, I'm going to hand over to you to take on the next segment of ours. Over to you, Anika.
Thank you. Hi, everyone. My name is Annika, and I am the manager of the Community of Practice on Environment, Climate, Conflict, and Peace. It is a mouthful. I've just put a link in the chat there. We are into the last half hour of this webinar, and so I have the pleasure of helping to, as I like to say, land the plane. We started by laying the foundation on this topic with Kira. We took a tour of the Resource Hub with Raquel. We did a deep dive on the Knowledge Hub for Locally Led Action on Climate, Peace, and Security with Becca. And then Julianne has done a deep dive on this handbook for disaster risk reduction, navigating fragility, conflict, and violence to strengthen community resilience. This last section is all about looking forward, is about applying these tools and exploring what resources we might still need. We already had an example from one of our humanitarian peers, Jane Halal, at Arij in the West Bank, navigating environmental governance and natural resource management. She had to go to a city council meeting, which is awesome. And it's now my pleasure to introduce one final example of applying these lessons learned in a completely different context. I'm honored to turn to Edgardo Sanchez, the National Safer Access Coordinator at the Colombian Red Cross, and at the same time would also like to introduce Nico Carrero from the Climate and Environment Charter team, who will be supporting us with interpretation and translation. I just remind you that you can click the CC button at the bottom of your screen to find captions and translate into the language of your choosing using the magic of technology. So over to you, Edgardo. Nice to have you here.
Gracias, muchísimas gracias a todos y todas por este espacio pues tan participativo de parte de todos ustedes y pues tratando y muy agradecido de la invitación a la Cruz Roja Colombiana.
Thank you all
Bueno,
so much. Oh, sorry. Thank you all so much for having me here today, and I'm really grateful to have the invitation from the Red Cross to speak today. For the context, now this is me speaking as Nico. I'm going to be translating today for Edgardo, just in case we have any hiccups with the translations. So Edgardo will speak as himself, and I will speak as if I am him, and I'll also facilitate some of the Q&A. And thank you all so much. Edgardo, por favor, muchas gracias.
perfecto. Pasamos a la presentación, por favor. Bueno, para la Cruz Roja Colombiana, precisamente hemos integrado en la resiliencia comunitaria temas de gestión de riesgo y análisis de contexto. Esto nos ha permitido operar de una forma segura y fortalecer las capacidades locales en entornos altamente inseguros. De hecho, Colombia tiene unas dinámicas propias muy complejas, sobre todo en temas de seguridad. Nosotros acá en Colombia, en los territorios con mayores efectos o cambios climáticos, suelen ser normalmente aquellos territorios que han sido golpeados por la presencia de actores armados, lo que crea un doble impacto en temas climáticos y de seguridad. El conflicto limita las capacidades estatales, reduce la inversión pública y afecta a los sistemas locales para la gestión de riesgo.
For the Colombian Red Cross, we have been working on work on community resilience when looking at managing risk and specifically within this context where in the local communities in Colombia, we're experiencing a lot of issues with insecurity, and some of the larger territories as well has been impacted by climate change. And it's also the same territories that are being impacted by armed conflict. So we have this double impact, both in terms of climate change, but also security. Conflict in turn limits the state capacities and the investment and possibility for the public and local systems to be able to manage this risk.
Sí, de hecho, la constante presencia de actores armados no estatales impone restricciones a la movilidad. Sobre todo, se crean fronteras invisibles y riesgos de incidentes, dificultando el ingreso de las organizaciones humanitarias, con un impacto de mayor durabilidad en temas de clima y de conflicto armado que genera una crisis recurrentes, desplazamientos forzados, pérdida de los cultivos y muchas limitaciones para el acceso a los insumos básicos y la seguridad alimentaria. Las comunidades quedan muy atrapadas entre ellos riesgos ambientales y riesgos de seguridad, reduciendo la capacidad de adaptación de estas comunidades.
In fact, the constant presence of some of these armed state actors poses restrictions on mobility. It creates really difficult conditions for humanitarian organizations to enter, and it's leading to as well reoccurring crises, forced displacement, crop loss, and increasing lack of access to working with communities. This has led to impacts on food security, among others, as well as lots of impacts on environmental and security risks and reduction of adaptive capacity to deal with these risks.
Como sociedad nacional hemos adaptado el enfoque de la resiliencia climática en temas de gestión de riesgo de desastres, sobre todo integrando los temas humanitarios con lo climático y sobre todo realizando los análisis de contexto de cada uno de los territorios para poder avanzar lógicamente en la entrega de esta asistencia humanitaria. De hecho, tenemos un enfoque de género, de protección, género e inclusión que maneja también la Federación Internacional de Sociedades Nacionales, como lo planteó ahorita la compañera. Sin embargo, esto nos permite analizar las necesidades a partir de las diferencias propias de los territorios, podernos abordar de manera que la ayuda humanitaria sea justamente lo que requieren las comunidades. Esto contribuye a una acción sin daño, precisamente con ese enfoque humanitario que manejamos nosotros como una institución independiente, imparcial, pero sobre todo que somos auxiliares de los poderes públicos en asuntos humanitarios.
As a national society, we've been adapting our disaster risk management approaches to include further climate context and above all be able to address humanitarian issues despite these contexts. This has meant above all doing analysis at the territory or jurisdiction level to advance the delivery of humanitarian assistance. In fact, we've been using a gender-sensitive approach that our colleague from or Julianne had shared a bit earlier. And this allows us to be able to look at what each different territory needs and what each different community requires, which leads to a humanitarian response that is aligned with the no harm principle. And this allows us as well to be able to continue to fulfill the commitments to independence and impartiality and maintaining those ethical concerns. Yeah, sorry.
En la otra presentación, pasamos. Gracias. Eso, esa. Invirtiendo un poco en temas de seguridad, manejamos a nivel de sociedades nacionales un marco general como una estrategia internacional, sobre todo un ciclo para el acceso más seguro. Esto implica como un ciclo, este ciclo parte del acceso como punto de partida y resultado final de las acciones y las medidas del acceso más seguro. Esto implica que nosotros como organización realizamos un mapeo de actores comunitarios, actores también por presencia de actores armados, actores estatales como administraciones locales. Esto nos permite, lógicamente, tener mayor incidencia y aceptación de la institución. Planteamos rutas seguras y puntos críticos. Dentro de este acceso también planteamos un trabajo con equipos locales con el conocimiento territorial, lógicamente para adaptar toda esa acción humanitaria precisamente a las necesidades que tienen las comunidades. Esto, lógicamente, si tenemos acceso de la institución y tenemos acceso de las personas que hacen parte de la institución, esto nos garantiza un parte de seguridad.
In terms of security concerns, we operate using the Safer Access framework that is happening both nationally in Colombia, but is also an international strategy through the Red Cross. And it sort of is a cycle that starts with access as the starting point and ends with actions and measures. What this means is that we conduct a stakeholder mapping, including both armed and state actors, local administrators, and this, through the mapping exercise, allows us to have a greater impact, efficacy, and ultimately uptake of the intervention. Part of this also includes planning safe routes and critical points of access, working with local teams who have key local context to allow us to adapt humanitarian programming to local needs. And this allows us in turn to have a greater level of security when we deliver aid.
Continuando con el ciclo, pasamos a la percepción. De hecho, la percepción nos permite a nosotros generar mayor credibilidad en la institución, comunicación con un mandato neutral, explicar qué hacemos, cómo lo hacemos, con quién lo hacemos, qué vamos a hacer a las comunidades. Eso de cierta manera contribuye a que haya una buena percepción de la institución, la aceptación sea mayor y los actores armados precisamente no nos garantizan directamente la seguridad a nosotros, pero sí nos garantizan un máximo acceso y que las comunidades puedan acceder a la ayuda humanitaria que llevamos como institución, transparencia en las actividades climáticas y en las actividades de gestión de riesgo y el monitoreo, sobre todo, hacer monitoreo también cuando puede haber una mala percepción por hechos que en el pasado hayan influido, sobre todo en relacionamiento con los actores armados.
Continuing on through the cycle, we move on to perception. Having a positive perception of what we're doing allows for greater credibility of the institution. It allows us to continue working through with neutrality by being able to explain what we do, how we do it, and with whom. This in turn allows the organization to have a good perception and then gain access to the communities, although we may not always face security. It guarantees that we can have transparency in communicating both our climate risk activities, our risk management and monitoring, and it allows us to continue to work through delivering humanitarian aid despite some of these security concerns.
Dentro de este mismo ciclo tenemos la aceptación que es el resultado final de la confianza de las comunidades y nuestros beneficiarios. Precisamente en temas de aceptación abordamos tratamos de garantizar que las comunidades acepten a la institución pero también a las personas que hacemos parte de la institución y que estamos presentes en las comunidades, generando confianza en los líderes comunitarios, pues, con las autoridades locales, civiles y ambientales, presencia continua en las comunidades y participación en los planes locales para mucha resiliencia. Se le da mucha participación a las comunidades. Esto genera confianza de la institución con ellos y lógicamente podemos abordar todos los problemas que se presenten, sobre todo en temas climáticos y temas de violencia.
Next in the cycle, we have acceptance, which is the end result of trust with communities that are receiving aid. To address these concerns, we need to make sure that communities feel that they can accept what we are doing, and this means involving individuals, local communities. We strive to be present with these communities by building trust with community leaders, including local, civilian, and environmental authorities, and maintaining a constant presence in these communities, engaging in local planning. And this community involvement has been particularly important for generating greater resilience. In turn, this builds trust between the communities and the organization. And this trust is what then allows us to be able to address all problems that may arise, especially those related to climate, but also armed violence as well.
Y la seguridad, en estos temas de cambio climático y temas de los daños causados por el conflicto armado, hemos adaptado a nivel de Sociedad Nacional de la Cruz Roja Colombiana, adaptado protocolos de seguridad, de actualización de contexto, movilización discreta y sobre todo hemos formado, hemos capacitado a todo nuestro personal en temas de acceso humanitario y sobre todo en riesgos operativos. Esto lo que realmente nos ha significado mucho. Colombia tiene una situación muy compleja de conflicto armado, lo que nos ha llevado a tener restricciones incluso para el acceso a muchas comunidades por parte nuestra para garantizar la seguridad de nuestro personal, pero también la seguridad de las personas beneficiarias.
Finally,
Sí,
within
adelante.
Finally, within security, we have the issues both by climate change through disaster, but also the damage caused from armed conflict. We've adapted the Colombian policies at the national society level through adapting security protocols and looking at things like movement. And most importantly, we've been trying to train and provide training to all of our staff on humanitarian access issues and especially operational risks that they may face when trying to do disaster relief work. For example, Colombia has a very complicated situation on the ground with armed conflict, which has led to many access on restrictions for communities. And it means that we have to ensure the safety both of our staff, but also of beneficiary communities.
Pasamos a la otra presentación para aprovechar el minuto que nos queda.
We can go
Sí,
move on to the last slide.
gracias. Gracias. Precisamente hemos adaptado todo el marco para acceso más seguro, aterrizado en normas de seguridad en terreno. Marcado en 8 elementos. Estos 8 elementos hacemos análisis de contexto, analizamos las bases jurídicas y políticas, aceptación de la organización, aceptación de las personas, percepción, gestión de los riesgos operacionales, comunicación interna, comunicación externa por parte de las comunidades, pero también por parte de toda, cuando hablamos de esa comunicación externa, tenemos constante comunicación con las comunidades, también con actores armados, independientemente si son estatales o no son estatales, tenemos que garantizar que la acción humanitaria llegue a los territorios y precisamente nos apoyamos con otros componentes del movimiento, como con el Comité Internacional de la Cruz Roja, que es uno de los componentes del movimiento que actúa en zonas de conflicto armado. Con ellos articulamos de manera muy organizada para hacer esos análisis de contexto y poder, de cierta manera, tener diálogos humanitarios con los actores armados que nos permitan llegar a más territorios en el país. Gracias.
So here we have the framework for safer access, which we have adapted to take into greater consideration climate concerns as well. But we have to maintain safety and security. And to do this, we maintain constant communication with all actors, including armed actors, regardless of not whether or not a actor is a part of the state or not. We need to reach the territories, and we do so through our network, relying on the International Committee of the Red Cross as one of these key organizations that helps us operate in armed conflict zones. And it also allows us to do context analyses to understand what we need to engage in humanitarian dialogue with armed actors, which ultimately allows us to increase our access and have more impact throughout the territories of the country. And here we have these 8 different pillars that are a part of the framework to ensure that we have safer access.
So, gracias, Julián. Nicolás, gracias.
Muchísimas gracias, Eduardo y Nico. Really, thank you so much for the presentation. We appreciate the way that you've helped and shared more about how the Colombia Red Cross enables climate resilience and DRR programming in areas affected by FARC presence and insecurity, and sharing some really practical approaches that have helped you navigate safety and security constraints on the ground. I come from a peace building background, and there's so much of what you shared that is so familiar to me, so many of the same concepts, and it's really cool to see how that comes together in practice. So thank you. We have a few more minutes together as a group, and what I'd love to do is actually just encourage a little bit of reflection on how resources, how interacting with toolkits and resources and reports, all of a lot of what has been shared today, how we interact with it in our work. So if the amazing tech support brilliance can get a Mentimeter up on the screen, I'm going to be asking for a little bit of your reflection. I believe it should be coming soon. Thank you. Oh, love a blank page. That's fun. It's always the technology that you think is going to work and then it doesn't actually work in the moment. So while we are attempting to get this Mentimeter up here to work, I'd love to encourage you to post in the chat in case we can't get it up. So the question that I have for you first is just what's working. If you could share an example of something, one thing, here we go. I'm gonna put this in the chat here. I'm gonna put this here. What's working? So share one thing that has helped you advance climate or environmental programming in FCAS. And I'm most specifically curious about a resource, an example, a case study. So I want everybody to maybe close their eyes and think about a time. Oh, there we go. Look at that. Okay, thank you. So you can join at menti.com. You can do this on your phone or your computer. And then you can use this code here so that you can type in an answer. And I was just about to say, if you want to come on a journey with me, I invite you to close your eyes and think about a time that a resource, maybe a report, maybe an article, maybe the resource came in the form of a person, came into you and helped you advance climate or environmental programming at some point. Oh, and thanks for putting the link in the chat, Natasha. That's great. So again, what's working? What is something that has helped you advance climate or environmental programming in FCAS? And I will say that our speakers are also allowed to fill out the Menti. This is everybody's included here. So if you go to menti.com, then you'll be able to post something in. Anybody? Okay, we have community needs engagement. Nice, and we heard that come up both in both of our examples today. We have working with communities who understand best what they need. Exactly, that's really sort of the cornerstone. I think we heard it across sort of everybody's either toolkit or example, thinking about Colombia, that sort of community engagement as a cornerstone for safety, thinking about the West Bank, building community resilience plans in sort of a bottom-up model. We have the team at Africa Women Rising in Uganda and their approach to resilience design. Yes. Oh, I love that. Feel free to use this to dump resources. That's great. We have a case study from a Somali experience. Isn't it interesting how sometimes hearing stories learning from other people's experiences, much like the two that we've had today. That for me at least is sometimes my best tool for learning, is hearing those stories. Climate finance in Somalia, conflict sensitivity approaches, absolutely. And so much of it's really sort of thinking through in our humanitarian work in fragile or conflict affected settings, how can we add that layer of conflict sensitivity analysis? Rallying colleagues with the shared goal of figuring out FCAS. So much to learn from putting our brains and experiences together. So true. Good context analysis, training disaster relief staff on humanitarian access issues, the ECCP community. Oh, that makes my heart very happy. That's the community of practice on environment, climate, conflict, and peace that I mentioned. Working with non-state-owned groups, absolutely. Okay, at the risk of throwing everybody off their game, I'm going to ask if we can advance to the next slide, because I have one more Menti question and we have like 2 minutes left. Is it possible to go? Yeah, thank you. Just 1 minute on what's needed. Now that we've thought about what's working, what do you need? Is there a resource you wish you had? Is there a case study you wish you had? Is there a toolkit you wish you had? What is needed? Is there anything that you need? And I'll just give you a minute here before I hand back to our hosts at the Charter to close us out. So again, is there anything that you need? And I will be curious to see if nothing comes up, because that means maybe sometimes the problem is finding time and space to use the resources that we have. Data, reliable data. Yep. Time. Absolutely. Time and resources to bring these experiences together more often. Absolutely. Yep. Well, there is a section in the hub on data, and I'll put that link in the chat just one more time, so that you have access to that. More focused case studies to get inspired, yeah. And sometimes those case studies come in written form, and sometimes they come in the form of being together. And amen, flexible funding. Oh my goodness, yes. If I could wave a magic wand and change one thing about the world, that is what I would create more of. Okay. Well, I encourage you, we're going to stop screen sharing here in a minute, but I encourage you to keep writing in, because what we'll do on the back end with this information is use it to see if we can't collect a few more resources, if there are any needs here, like case studies or data that we can provide to help. Honesty about failures and what we learned from them, absolutely. Maybe we can find some resources along those lines. So please do keep filling the Menti, even if we are not sharing screen, or feel free to use the chat, or just get in touch. The goal of the link that I've put in the chat is to provide that access to information. And I appreciate all of your willingness to get on technology and share some of these ideas on Mentimeter. It's really appreciated. Where would we like to receive examples and docs for tools and resources? That sounds like a perfect question for either Nishani or Natasha to address in their closing remarks. So I'm going to hand back over so that they can help close out this webinar.
Thanks, Annika, and thank you as well to all of the speakers. I'm still so grateful for the incoming responses here. The Menti will stay open, so please keep sharing. I'm going to stop sharing my screen, and just say, today's session was, I found incredibly important and meaningful and interesting, in helping us as a humanitarian sector, as charter signatories, and as partners from the ECCP community, to understand a bit more about how across different contexts we see how political constraints, insecurity, social and political tensions are intersecting with climate change, and how, especially through locally led initiatives and smart collaboration and well-timed intervention, we can really both meaningfully strengthen resilience and learn how to navigate some of these complexities together. And I think today highlights some of the progress that has already been made, that is being made, as well as some of the support needed. And I know from the Charter Secretariat side, for us as a nimble body that can try the best we can to support signatories in the sector in navigating emerging challenges, we're always keen to hear from you about what you need, what you're looking for, how you can better advance the climate and environmental charter commitments. And so with that, we're hoping you can stay in touch. I'll share this last slide just so you can, well, it won't let me share my slide. I'm having some screen sharing challenges today, but you can stay in touch with us at secretariat@climatecharter.org. You can check out our website, which includes an entire tools and resources platform that includes what Raquel shared earlier, the resources that Julianne and Becca shared, as well as case studies, not just on climate action in fragile and conflict-affected settings, but on broadly climate and environmental action in the humanitarian sector. And with that, thanks again to our speakers and to the participants, and we hope that you have a good rest of your morning, afternoon, and evening wherever you are. So thank you very much.
Thank you.
Thanks, everyone. Bye-bye.
Thank you. Bye.
Everyone, bye.